Welcome to the International Center for Cultural Studies webinar series. Dr. Desmond Sham, I'm the assistant professor at the International Master's Program in Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, National Yang Ming Chiang University. Today, we're very glad to have invited Dr. Lai Chee Kien to share with us on the topic of ambivalence for itinerants, hawker and hawker centers in Singapore. Dr. Lai Chee Kien is a registered architect. He's also a historian of art, architecture, settlements, and landscapes in Southeast Asia. He's now the Lee Kong Chian Research Fellow at the National Library of Singapore. So there is one recent book illustrated by Chang Yang that is translated by Dr. Lai has just come out a few months ago, I guess. So you can see that from the screen right now. So shall we give the floor to Dr. Lai to share with us his talk today? So Dr. Lai, please.
Thank you, Desmond. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I know Friday afternoons are precious, and and just before the weekend. So the title of the talk is a result of trying to make sense of how the hawkers were being treated in Singapore, which is a country very different from other Southeast Asian countries, mainly because you will not find hawkers in Singapore, at least those that are sort of not licensed and things like that. They would be required to have a license, and not only that, they have to be housed in structures called the hawker centers in Singapore, which is also an oxymoron, right? Because if you are a hawker, how can you be itinerant rather than sort of be fixed in a location, which is what the hawkers, as we call them, are in Singapore, they have a fixed location to sell their things. Okay, and the reason why I talked about ambivalence is because of the historic nature of how such hawker centers have come into being. On the one hand, they are allowed to continue their business, right? But with certain conditions, shall we say. But on the other hand, there are also sort of, there were times when the different colonial governments and, the government after independence in Singapore were also sort of trying to remove hawkers from the streets. So it is these two factors, they providing food, right? Relatively affordable food for a wide population. So, and that function is then counterbalanced with all of the sort of things that help to regulate, their business, and also regulate the different things like cleanliness and so on and so forth. Okay. In the talk, I shall also sort of talk about the different time periods. So let us begin. Oops. So for those of you who are not have not visited Singapore before, what I'm talking about, starts from the early settlement by the British on the southern banks, as you can see, the sort of a very dark area on the top left, where the town started to grow. Okay, and at that time, what you see on the screen, the shop houses form the sort of major urban fabric, right, in Singapore town, as it was known at the time. So as the name suggests, you have shops on the ground floor, and then you have people's homes or residences on the upper floors. And sometimes these shop houses would range between 2 stories, and to the highest one that I've seen is 4 stories, right? Those are very few nowadays. So this is the urban fabric that you see, right? On the bottom left, this was what the Chinese enclave, right? 搞车水, 牛车水, 古家水. And on the right, bottom right, you see how the streets are also sort of being used, right? But this is not a common sight anymore unless the spaces are permitted by the different authorities. Okay. So on the other side of the Singapore River, right? Just now we were on one side. Now this is on the other side. You can also see the same kind of shop houses, right? So they connect up most of the streets, and one of the main reasons why they are aligned is because of a very strict law that was passed in 1822 by the British government to allow for a 5-foot way, right? What we call a 5-foot way, or kind of a veranda, for pedestrians, right, and to move about. Okay, and then of course next to it, this would be next to the roads. And in the equatorial climate in Singapore, right, the weather with sun and rain, they prove to be very useful because you can still move about in the city using these 5-foot ways. So this is the early structure of the town, and here you see a commemorative book from 1985, right? This was 1 year before the hawkers were completely moved into, out of the streets and into the hawker centers. So this book, published by the National Archives, commemorates the 5-foot way traders, like 五角鸡行业. And you can see at the bottom right there you have barbers, you have, and you can imagine there are also hawkers selling food and things like that. On the top right, you see a section where you cut this shop house from top to bottom, and you can see the pink area is where the 5-foot way would be, right? 五角鸡. So this was a very important space of a social space, right? And in due course, right, there would be a lot of hawkers and different trades, right, occupying them, right? So much so that the colonial government began to limit and or even to sort of prohibit, right, to stop them being hawking on the streets. So this is a photograph I took of a shop house along Bunta Street, which is in the town area, and you can see the red sign 禁止小贩, right, which is no hawking, to show you how bad the situation was that they had to ban them from the streets. Okay, and if you look at how hawkers have largely been dealt with in Southeast Asia, Professor Terry McGee, right, who has been looking at these kind of informal trades, and itinerant hawkers, suggested that after some studies of different places, right, including Hong Kong, I think Desmond, you might know this, that usually there will be 3 main methods to sort of resolve this problem, right, or much less solve it. The first one is to use laws and bylaws and issue of licenses. So these are sort of like very official legislation, right, by rules and by laws to limit, right, or to stop hawking activities. So that's the first method, which is probably the most common. The second method, which some countries have been able to do, right, in most countries now, they have some form of spatial control. Okay? And this is what the Singapore government has done, right, most significantly, to transfer these hawker activities into specific new places for them. Okay, so spatial control, right, using spaces, right, to sort of change the way the hawking can be done. Okay, and of course the third method, right, educational means, right, is to encourage these hawkers to go into other professions, right, and to in order to sort of reduce the number of hawkers or even to sort of move them away. So in the early days in Singapore, the first and second methods were used, but by the post-war era, right, after 1945, all 3 methods were used in Singapore. Okay, and then on the right, you can see that part of the second method, right, using spatial control. These are the ways that Terry McGee suggested how food stalls, right, uncooked food stalls or markets can be designed, right, or laid out. So in Singapore, you can see that they are everywhere, right? They go on foot, right, on the left hand side, and then they have wheels, right, 3 wheels or 4 wheels, and then on the right, right, some of them become so popular that they just fix themselves onto a certain location, right? People will come to them on both sides of the road. So you can see from this old photograph, probably from the 1950s, that not only the roads, right? You have 2 rows of hawkers on both sides of the vehicular road, right? Therefore, congesting traffic. But also in the 5 footways that I showed you earlier, there would also have been hawkers as well, right? Some of them would be stationed there. Some of them would be moving about in the 5 footways themselves. So these are the sort of various hawkers. These are some photographs or slides that I've been able to collect from specific members of the public who happen to have photographed them. This is a dough candy hawker, right? And then of course this one is I think it's quite precious. This is a wayang, right, which is like a Chinese theater, right? In this particular one, this is Sin Sai Feng, which is a Hokkien Chinese opera troupe, which has set up a temporary stage somewhere on the south coast, right, around West Coast Road or Keppel Road, near opposite the Haw Villa in Singapore. And you can see, right, as the stage is being set up, you can see the hawkers, right, be also getting ready to set up stall and also to prepare for the performance, which will probably sort of take place at night. Okay, so there would be hawkers who also sort of move around with also these kinds of temporary constructions in Singapore. So just a very quick timeline to suggest how bad the problem was. So firstly, already by 1903, right, this was a few decades after the British landed in Singapore, and it had already become a sort of a big problem for the municipal commissioners, right, people who look after the town, and mainly because apart from the British and also sort of foreigners that were working in the city, right, they would also employ locals, right, but they would not be employing the locals as middle level management. And a lot of all of the locals would be hired as stenographers, typists, secretaries, or even those folks that sort of messengers, right, to pass messages from one office to another office. So these they would not have any place to go, because in those days there would only be eating houses, right, what they call eating houses or restaurants, that they would not be able to go on a daily basis, right? They would rely on hawkers for their lunches or sometimes even dinners. So the hawkers make use of the opportunity to sell the ware in the town area itself, and thereby when there are more sort of people, they become very, very crowded. Okay, so they recognize the situation as early as 1903. And then in 1906, right, the government gave the municipal commissioners the authority to do something about the hawkers, right? And then and a year later, the bylaw, some sort of the bylaws came into place. Okay, in 1908, right, there was a suggestion of this term called hawker shelter, which we will talk about later. And then they continue to sort of talk about this, right? They actually couldn't implement it, and so and in the meantime, right, there were sort of more and more hawkers. Okay, so the discussion that had been ongoing since that time came to a kind of a halt, right, during the World War I, right? Of course, it did not happen in Singapore, but it affected Great Britain, who was controlling Singapore. And of course, there was also recession, there was sort of a scarcity of materials as well. Okay, and then of course, after the war, the idea got traction again, and then subsequently, the first ones were built in the 1920s. Okay, so this is a kind of rough idea of what happened. And what I've done is that I have divided the hawkers into two large groups, right? Food, and then those who sell household items and services. Okay, so these are the sort of two large groups. And then food, of course, you have cooked and uncooked food, right? And in terms of time frame, we suggested that it started in 1908. But these are sort of four categories, right, including the present day, that we could sort of identify and talk about the different characteristics in these different stages. Okay, at one point in time, it was suggested that this current phase 2011 to 2027. The end date, right? I've been advised not to use it, but this is what I found in some of the reports. Okay, and you can notice between the phases are largely continuous, except between phase 3 and phase 4, right, from 1986 to 2011, which we will talk about afterwards. Okay, so during phase 1 and phase 2, you have hawkers shelter, hawker pitches, including a form known as a Pasar Malam, night market. And then phase 3 and 4, we have this thing which is now officially called the food center, but everyone calls it the hawker center. So phase 1 was about 50 years, right? 42 years. And one of the most important triggers, right, of the discussion was really not about the hawkers themselves, but about sanitation in Singapore, right? Because at that time, the municipal commissioners invited Calcutta's chief health officer, W.J.R. Simpson, to come to Singapore to make a report, right? So he came to Singapore, studied the conditions, right, which were not very hygienic at that time, and published a report, right, a sanitation report, which is a short form, in 1907. Okay, so 1907 was the publication of the report, and then 1 year later, right, specifically on September 11, right, 1908, the municipal board met, and they, of course, discussed the Simpson's recommendations, right, how to decongest the city. So on the left, you see a plan of shop houses, right? But these shop houses, it's interesting because they are back to back. Okay, so you have the front facing one side of the street. Okay, and then at the back, you would also be connected to the back of another shop house. Okay, so this also means that they become fire hazards, on top of sanitation concerns. Okay, so the suggestion from Simpson was to cut more back lane. So you can see the gray shaded area, right? Was a recommendation to sort of, in terms of creating more sanitary conditions, right? You would have to make access to the back part of the shop houses. So this meant sacrificing some of the shop houses, but also to sort of shorten the back areas. And in this case, you can see that if you cut big enough, you can create a kind of a space. Okay, so on the right, this is what we see in the area that was recommended. Okay, so the recommendation was to in this particular area, right? On that day, the municipal board met, and its deputy president by the name of John Paul Glaze suggested that this area, right, between South Bridge Road, China Street, and so on, right, what you see on the screen, they should also sort of be cut, right? The back lanes and all that should be cut so that we can create this space. And they would try to solve two problems at the same time, right? Kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, right? One was, of course, in the course of creating the back lanes, they would try also to create a space at the back of the within the back lane area as a place called a hawker shelter, or shelter for hawkers. Okay, so later on they become to know as a hawker shelter, and they would move the hawkers who had been plying their trades on the 5-foot ways into the that space itself, right? They would be provided with water, and then they would also have to pay some rental to occupy the shelter space. The provision of water was a significant one because prior to that, right, apart from congesting the city, right, its streets and its 5-foot ways, the other big problem that the hawkers faced was that not all of the food was also prepared hygienically. So, for example, if hawkers use water from the same well, right? In these days of COVID-19, we know this very well, right? So if a well is contaminated, then everybody using the water, including the hawkers, will also sort of not have very good food, and therefore there were high instances of disease transmission in the form of cholera and diphtheria, right? So these were sort of big problems. So by supplying water and by putting them in one place, number one, they could control it, right? Number two, they could ensure a cleaner form of food that's being prepared. Okay, so this was discussed and all that, but as you saw just now, right? Nothing was sort of really done except trying to keep talking about the issue until in around 1920, the municipality's health officer, right, Dr. William Middleton, right, on the bottom left you see the Middleton Hospital, right, which is now the Communicable Diseases Center, was built, right, and in his name, right, was to commemorate him, because apart from tending to all of the sort of health issues in Singapore, right, and medical concerns, he started to classify the hawkers into two large groups. Okay, so as you see on the top, firstly, hawkers of uncooked food, right, fish, poultry, and so on and so forth. These would be from the farms or imported from elsewhere. And then the second group would be hawkers of cooked food. Okay, so these they were sort of targeted at food. Okay, so those that are carrying commodities, household items, those were not an immediate sort of concern. Okay, and for hawkers of cooked food, they were further divided into two types. Okay, those who already sort of set up stalls in the streets, right, in the photograph that I showed just now, and the second, which are termed basket hawkers. Okay, those whose businesses are not enough for them to sort of set up stall or have a sort of big enough clientele to support them. Okay, so the suggestion was that hawker shelters for hawkers, or hawker shelters, would cater only to type B, the basket hawkers. Okay, so only they would be able to be eligible for placement within the hawker shelters themselves. Okay, those who have considerable business, they have to be evicted, right? They have to be moved out, and then of course there would be no place for them in the hawker shelters. But those for uncooked food would eventually find their way into the markets, which we will talk about later. So so we see the two stages, right? 1908 was the first suggestion. And then with the 1920, there is a proper classification of the different types of hawkers. Okay, And with that, right, and because the post-war conditions after 1918 became a lot more stable, right, there was some money to start building infrastructure. You can see 6, right? I would say 6 here that you see in this map, right, from the municipality that was published, right? So and you can see, right, the dotted oval shape suggests to you where the Singapore thriving districts were. Okay, so where number 1 and 2 are, right, on the screen, this is the area near to the Singapore River, right, where the British had set up their colonial offices and what they call cantonment. And then, of course, number 2 is within the Chinese enclaves itself. Can you hear me, Desmond? Okay, all right, just making sure. So that's one big area, right? Number 1 and 2, they were built for that area. And then you see number 3 and 4, which is on the other river system, right, which is the Kallang and Rochor system. And these were built, right, for that. So if you look at the early history of Singapore, the 2 oval-shaped areas are the sort of the busiest, sort of town areas in Singapore. And then number 5 was built in 1929, right? So this was about 10 years later, which is further away from the city center. And then number 6, right, is even further away. So the phase 1 hawker shelters, right, included Telok Ayer Group. Okay, this was not one because there was an experimental stage from 1921 onwards, right? They would be building shelters and then they would be demolishing them. They would be transferring hawkers to different places. So it's a bit difficult to describe in detail. So we'll just group them as the Telok Ayer Group. Okay, so this was the experimental stage. And then the second one is People's Park Shelter, right? Some of you may have gone to the People's Park area in Singapore, which we'll talk about later. And then number 3 is Kearney Street. Okay, so this is the defunct street, right? It doesn't exist anymore. And then you have Queen Street Shelter. Okay, so those are the 4 in town, and then Balestier and Lim Tua Tau road shelters are the ones that, having resolved some of the hawkers in town, they started to also look at places further away. So up to World War II, right? These were the sort of 6 that were built. Okay, and it wasn't that the hawkers were sort of issue was completely resolved, right? The hawker shelters could only solve sort of a small section of the hawkers, right? And you can see the continually the municipality had to sort of defend, right? Why they had to sort of allow the hawkers to continue, right? They couldn't, they didn't want to evict them all completely or pass a very strict law, right? So this is the part of the ambivalence part I'm talking about. Okay, so let's look at some of the early hawker shelters, right? So the interesting one, of course, is here, right? People's Park Shelter. You can see there is a market and hawker shelter. Okay, so because hawkers are divided into sort of household items, right, services, these would and also uncooked food, right? Like vegetables and poultry and meat. Those would go into the market, and then there would also be a section for the food, right? For the class 2B, right? The basket hawkers. Okay, so if you go to People's Park today, you will be surprised that you have so many food centers and all that. And part of the reason was because the second hawker shelter was built there from 1923 onwards. But in 1966, there was a fire, right, that burned down the market and hawker shelter. And therefore, in the rebuilding process, right, that the government, right, by the time it was already independence, they wanted to build, a larger structure. So you can see this you can see the construction of buildings such as People's Park Complex, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what replaced it did not disallow sort of hawkers. In fact, if you go there today, right, you still see a lot of sort of food stalls. This is the one that is slightly further away, and this is also the only one that is surviving from the phase 1 hawker shelters. Okay, and if you look carefully on the map, right, where the red arrow is, you can see that it's almost like 4 fingers, right, connected by something at the back, and it's slightly different from today, right, because the parts that were uncovered have already been sort of covered up. But the idea was to have a open air kind of shelter, right? There's a shelter, but you could have ventilation passing through it. Okay, and then of course subsequently they were also covered up, which is what you see today. So if you're in Singapore and you want to visit the earliest hawker shelter, right, apart from Telok Ayer Market, Lau Pa Sat, this would be in its specific form for a market as well as a food hawker shelter. So that's phase 1. And what was the trigger for, again, the phase 2 is that, with 6 hawker shelters, it really didn't solve the problem. And after World War II, right, a lot of people, went back into the poverty bracket again. And with also new arrivals in Singapore, the easiest way to secure some sort of business, right, was to try to sell food, right? Very much like the night markets in Taiwan. There's some echo in the background.
The staff who are not from the site to be trained elsewhere first, and then after they are posted to the site to align whatever they've been trained with.
Desmond, can you hear the feedback?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, phase 2, sorry. Phase 2 would deal with the post Second World War situation, right? A lot more people have become hawkers, and it got sort of also out of hand, right? So what happened was the colonial government again conducted another study. So if you remember the first sanitation report led to the establishment of hawker shelters, this time round after the war, right? The report of the hawker inquiry, right? So hawker inquiry report in 1950, which was conducted on a very large scale, right, involving a lot of people, but led by Professor Thomas Silcock, who was at the time teaching at the University of Malaya. He made a report. He conducted a lot of surveys, and then, of course, the burning question that the colonial government asked was, what do we do with all of these hawkers? And surprisingly enough, right, the answer came back that hawkers were still a very important part of the social life of people in Singapore, and that one of the best ways to resolve it again is to use the hawker shelter model that was already established pre-war, but to build more of them, to build different kinds of hawker shelters, to try to solve different types of problems, like congestion in the city, the housing areas, and so on and so forth. So the 1950 report was it was actually quite comprehensive, and it persuaded the colonial government to start to incorporate these hawker shelters in the new estates that were coming up. So say, for example, like Tiong Bahru, Whampoa, right? And also to create different types. Right? So for example, the Esplanade, which we'll talk about, which is next to the sea. Okay, so the crucial thing to remember is that the 1950 with the report, right? This was the start date, right up to about 1971 or 72. Right, this would be phase 2. Okay, so apart from the construction of more hawker shelters, right? What the report did was to suggest, right, that because most of the hawkers would not indicate prices, right? They have to start to use signage, right? They have to indicate the prices so that they don't change the prices, at the whim and fancy of the hawkers, right? That the public should know what they are, what the price should be. Okay, so that's one. And the second thing that came out of the report was that already in the pre-war situation, where people would identify with the streets, okay, because in the pre-war to partly solve the problem, right, before 1945, right, they would also allow certain streets to have hawkers, but then they would prohibit hawkers from certain streets. So like the Buntat Street, which I showed you earlier. So people started to be identify with streets, and this is a kind of an interesting legacy, because if you go to the most of the hawkers today who have moved around from place to place, they would still be identified with the street, or the area that they come from. So for example, bottom left, you can see China Street fritters, right? There were quite a number of hawker stalls along China Street, right, in the Chinese enclave, sorry. And then of course Sin Lu, right, in Margaret Drive. So if you come to Singapore, you can see, right, people still using this Bedok Chui Kueh, things like that. So they will still sort of make some kind of identification, even as they move between different parts of Singapore, or they start to have the franchises. Okay, so something that also happened in the public housing phase, right, which technically started in 1927, but many more housing estates were also planned after the war, right, by the Singapore Improvement Trust. So these are some of the early markets, right, and food centers that the Singapore Improvement Trust had constructed for new estates, right? So as part of the facilities, right, in new estates, they will also start to build things like these. Okay, but the other thing, of course, was with these new estates, there would also be the establishment of night markets, who would also sort of be semi-legal, right? They would be occupying a particular street very close to the construction areas. Okay, and as you can see, right, this is Tiong Bahru, right? It started out as just a very simple shelter, and then subsequently it changed. Okay, so this is an example of food hawker shelter in a housing estate, right? And it's now become very popular. But these pictures that I show here are the earlier forms, right? Not the present one. Then you have Commonwealth Avenue, which is also in Queenstown, right? Which was a very large housing estate, right? So this was along Margaret Drive. Okay, and as you can see, right, they would they have different functions, right? There would be a post office on top, right? There would be food center at the bottom, and then this is the Esplanade hawker shelter that I talked about. As you can see, it was facing the southern waterfront in a kind of a horseshoe shape, right? And you can see the kind of different stalls that were built, and sometimes they would even have outdoor seating, right? As you see on the bottom left. Okay, so 1950 onwards, phase 2 saw the beginning of different kinds of forms, right? So this is in the city, and also in renewing the town, right? Empty spaces were also considered. So for example, this was a slaughterhouse, right, in Jalan Besar of Singapore. And sort of they had to move the slaughterhouse, the abattoir, to outskirts of town, right? Because this was still part of the city. And currently there is a Berset Food Center that now sits on the side, right? But if you go there, right, you won't see the slaughter of animals, but you will be able to taste the products, right? Maybe not from Singapore. Okay, so that's phase two. So that's quite a lot of different types that started to emerge. Right? And from 1972 onwards to 1986, okay, so this was already 5 to 6 years after Singapore had attained independence. And of course, previously, the colonial government was in charge of municipal functions, which have now been transferred to the local government, right, from 1965 onwards. Okay, earlier on in 1959, Singapore already had a sort of self-governance, but it was 1971 with the withdrawal of the British troops that the final trace, of sort of British colonialism, formal traces, right? But because they still continued with things like the Commonwealth and all that, started. Okay, and from 1971 to 1986, this was the when about 100 over hawker centers were created. So you can see the transition from hawker shelter to hawker center, right? And of course, we now know why the name persisted, because people have been quite used to calling it hawker shelter. So it was so the form changed from a simple shelter to something that is a lot more organized. Right? We will talk about that slightly later on. So this is a map of more or less present day Singapore. Right, Singapore keeps changing, so it's never easy to get a fixed map. Right, but during that time, a very short period of about 15 years, a lot of the hawker centers or food centers sprang up across the island. Right, these are indicated as sort of a black spots, and they correspond roughly, with developmental patterns, right, as well as new housing estates, right? Because in this time, the Housing and Development Board, right, HDB, had taken over from the Singapore Improvement Trust in providing public housing, right? And a lot of the spots would correspond to these housing estates. Okay, so as you can see, right, this is a very famous photograph from a photographer by the name of Lee Kwong Ling. And even with the housing estates, you would still have hawkers. Okay, and that is also because partly, right, in the transition from mainly sort of kampongs or villages, or even sort of a town, to a completely new environment, there are certain things that are still not available. Right? As markets and all that are being set up, you would have the night markets. You also have these kinds of hawkers who would move from place to place. Okay. So in phase three, right, there were a lot of agencies, right, 3 main agencies, but all the different agencies were involved. Okay, because in terms of legislation, as long as there is a felt need to create a hawker center, any agency, so for example, Jurong Town Corporation, right, or Port of Singapore Authority, or for urban renewal, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, URA, was very much also involved in building. And if they were not able to build, they would also rely on the Public Works Department to build. Okay, and then of course, the biggest number would be in the housing estates that was managed by HDB, right, Housing Development Board. So you can see, these are sort of like 3 areas. The first one, of course, is to decongest the city areas. Okay, so as we saw, right, there are sort of so many different congested areas in Singapore, and so many of the early food centers was to try to resolve these issues, including sort of congested places like Adam Road, right, or Upper Thomson Road, that was seen as a congested with hawkers. Okay, and then in 1974, right, HDB also started to build many hawker centers, and then finally in the public realm, right, in the public realm, places like Chom Chom Food Center, right, which is in a private housing estate, they would also begin to get hawker centers as well. Phase 3 is characterized by a lot of legislation and planning. So, for example, in 1969, already the Public Health Act was formulated. Okay, and then in 1972, right, this was a period where there was a lot of collaboration between the different ministries, in particular between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Environment. Okay, and then the hawkers would actually be an entire department on its own. Okay, it had a registration and licensing section. Right, this was a continuing kind of function. And then there would be planning and development. Right, they would be seeing how they can create new spaces, right, in the form of hawker centers. And then there would be lastly, right, the very important part for the department to work, which is the enforcement, right, to look at the illegal hawkers and all that. Okay, so there was also a coordinating agency, right? So that's why you could see this kind of collaboration across the different statutory boards. Okay, so in 1973, the Sale of Food Act, right, which was something that started to give a lot of sort of a legal backing to create special groups, special squads, right, to start to take remove illegal hawkers from the streets. Okay, so this is Taman Serasi Food Center. This was a very early food center, right, which was similar to Newton Hawker Center. It was planned as a hawker center with a kind of a park setting, right next to the Botanic Gardens, who has also now sort of become a World Heritage Site, right? But even earlier on, the Botanic Gardens was a very popular place, right, for people to spend their leisure time or public holidays. And with the crowds also came the hawkers, right, that would crowd outside and sometimes inside the Botanic Gardens. So the Taman Serasi Food Center, which used to be opposite the Botanic Gardens, was built, right? And this was taken in by me in 2021, right? And you can see there is a seating that is semi-sheltered. Some of them are under trees, but some of the tables are in fact, in the unsheltered. Okay, so this was another sort of early phase, right, where you still have this. Right now, I think you can hardly sort of find these kinds of outdoor spaces, maybe apart from East Coast Park or something. This is the second type, right, which is mainly built by HDB in the housing estate, Tanglin Hall, right. Sadly, this will be, I think, rebuilt, right, in a later part of this year. But you can see the in the early days, in the 1970s, they were also sort of trying to create some form of design, right, using geometries, in this case, hexagons. Okay, and you can see it's also got a very interesting roof, right, which sort of serves as a kind of a ventilator, right? So that hot air, which rises to the top part of the hawker shelter, can also be dissipated, right? And moving air can move in. And you can see there's a sort of a big shade under which the stalls and the seats are. This is a later version, sometime in the 80s. Okay, so you can see the principles are more or less the same. Right? It's a big shelter, right? It's not air conditioned. Right? The sides are a bit, sort of designed so that they can prevent a little bit of sun and rain. Okay, so this is a later one, but also within a housing estate. Okay, and of course, one of the important points that we'll talk about later is the multi-ethnic nature, right? By creating this very big umbrella space, right, and allowing for different kinds of foods from different ethnic groups, you can start to sort of see how Singaporeans are starting to use the space, right, across the race sections. But also it is, this is 16 images of noodle dishes, right, from different ethnic groups. But you can see that it's also likely at the hawker center that people will try food from other ethnic groups, right, if they want to. Something that happened around this time, right, in the 1970s, was also that hawker center food, right, started to also be a kind of appreciated or being recognized as something that was important. And so with the building of the Mandarin Hotel along Orchard Road, the Chatterbox restaurant, right, under the banker, Mr. Lien Chow from UOB, he suggested that, for the restaurant called Chatterbox, that they would try to introduce 3 local dishes, right, of chicken rice, laksa, and char kway teow. Okay, so today, right, at Chatterbox, the chicken rice, right, which you see on the right, this is one that I tried, is probably the most popular. But somehow I think also people have forgotten that about laksa and char kway teow. But these were the 3, right, that were first introduced into a kind of a restaurant setting in a hotel. And then some other interesting facts is the use of these fluorescent lights. Okay, so you can on the right you can see a coffee shop with these different colored fluorescent lights. Usually, this is a kind of a signal to suggest that there is a zi cha store. Okay, so zi cha store is what we call zi cao. So you have someone who can cook different dishes. In the past, zi cao is a very there's a standard selection. Right? Sometimes there are 8 dishes and so on and so forth. And the lights are kind of an indication or a presence of a zi cao store. Okay, but the interesting thing is on the left, right, with the old Airport Road food center, they sort of kind of taken the kind of colored lights heritage, but this time around they sort of just painted the sort of different colors. Okay, so, but also it then changes the meaning of this kind of very small sort of trivia, right, that has to do with the fluorescent lights, right, which was a very early form of lighting, right, if they were operating at night. So just now I mentioned that there were 2 large types, right? So there was some of them were sort of moved to the market, right, to have sort of household services, right, raw food, meats and vegetables and fish and so on. And then there would be another area that would also be catering to food. So on the top colored image, right, the green part is the market, and the red part, right, are stalls for food. Okay, so it's quite typical especially in the housing estate, right? You would see that the market and the food center would be designed together. Okay, so these are some scenes, right? These are some elements from the typical hawker center, right? So fixed seating, right? On the top right, you see this very interesting phenomenon in Singapore where you use items to reserve seats. Okay, bottom left you can see that some of the seats are sort of adapted so that you could accommodate our disabled friends. Okay, and then the holes, right? These are sort of like holes for you to hang your umbrella or your walking stick, right? If you need the walking stick. Okay, so even more areas, right? Tapao trays. So the kind of a culture that within the space itself sort of change over time. Right? Okay, and there is this major use of melamine plates, okay, and trays. Okay, that is not very common, right? Sometimes it's color coded, either to differentiate the stalls or perhaps to create certain kind of identity for an entire hawker center. Okay. the hawker center is also a very highly serviced space, right? A lot of people don't really see this, right? But in the background, there are a lot of things that are sort of silently created for the thing. And the most important one, of course, is at the bottom right, which are the grease traps. Okay, so what grease traps do is, you can see as kind of a drawing there. Whatever sort of grease, or effluent that comes from the different stalls, or even for the patrons, they would be passed into this tank, right? And the grease and oil will float to the top, while the rest of the water would sort of be then passed to another chamber and then channeled to the public drains. Okay, so this ensures that the public drains do not get clogged up so easily. And in fact, there is a separate industry of people coming to extract the grease, right, and to sort of reuse and remanufacture it into some other kind of form that requires this kind of grease. Okay, and elsewhere you will see the electronic panels, right, and the meters, right, to gauge the usage of electricity and water by individual stalls. There are sort of nowadays, you can see, because if gas is not supplied, right, the cylinders will be just outside the hawker center. There are public telephones, fire safety, hose reels, and so on and so forth. Okay, and this is the cleanliness aspect of it, right? The toilets, tray return, washing areas, right? And these are some of the other sort of very quirky things that happen, right? Fake birds to scare away birds and all that. Finally, you also see sort of shrines, right? Here it's not easy to see on the top left, but there's a kind of Tuti Gong shrine, but there are also sort of other sort of Hindu deities and all that, because this is in the Serangoon Road area, right, where the different ethnic groups live. There would be rams, right, if they are raised, and then also some of the other activities that were sort of permitted by the town council for busking and for sort of fortune telling, and also the tissue seller, right? Most of these would be sold by our disabled friends. Okay, so when we normally in architecture, when we talk about this term called tropical architecture, we envision this kind of residence, right, with design almost as if you are in a holiday. But in fact, I'm trying to argue, when I try to study this, that the hawker center is also a very important tropical space as well, right? Mainly because, as you can see, right, the principles are the same. So, for example, the roof is raised, right, much higher, so that the hot air can be dissipated. Here you see at the top bar, you have gaps, right, between two roofs of different heights. Okay, sometimes you also have on the top right, it's a maximum market with a roof, right? But also jack roof, but also allowing some light to come in. Then of course you have mechanical ventilation. Right? On the bottom left, you see this big fan, but individual stalls will also have sort of installation of fans, and also exhaust system, right? Because and you can see they are sort of directed just above the cooking areas for the hawkers, and some of these exhaust pipes, as you see it in the first picture, right, in a drawing by my friend Mr. Khoo Hong Teng, that it can sort of occupy this massive space on the roof, right? Then when it rains, right, you need to have proper drainage, right, apart from the sort of grease traps and all that, toilets, waste collection. So all these needs to be considered. That helps to create a nice space. In 1987 and 1990, right, the environmental agency sort of started to create this demerit point system, right? And inspections are made in regard to whether bylaws were being violated. right? Littering, unhygienic practices, and so on and so forth. Okay, and in 1997, right, 1 or 2 decades later, NEA started this grading system. Okay, so in the top right, you can see this photograph with the hawker, right, with this green label that says B. Okay, so they're graded from A, B, C, and D. Okay, A being sort of the cleanest stall. So the suggestion is that, you know, if you want clean food, you should go to the stall with all these labels with A. Okay, and the left-hand side drawing is, you know, the places where you need to display those. You know, you don't have to display so many, you just need to display one, but those are the possible locations where you can display, you know, the grading. Okay, and of course, incidentally, it doesn't mean that if you have A, right, the food will be tastiest, because a lot of people in Singapore know that, right? Sometimes a stall can have a C grade, but you know, the food could be something that is better than a lot of other stalls. Okay, so those are the sort of different aspects of a physical structure of the hawker center, and something, and of course the function of the hawker center, right? Once you have created so many of them, the culture has changed as well. Okay, so now this part of the talk, I would like to sort of talk about what has changed since then, and it began in 1979 with the Speak Mandarin campaign. Okay, as you all know, in Singapore, right, there was a time when dialects were not Fangyuan, right? Was not seen to be moving the society forward, shall we say? And so there was this big campaign, and which, you know, continued to this day. You can see JJ Lin, right, trying to say that Huayi is cool. To the extent that, you know, they have to publish, you know, books, right, like these pamphlets, to tell the hawkers, right, how to call the sort of ingredients, right, in Chinese. Okay, so to do this, right, you can see that hawkers were sort of one of the big target groups. Okay, and you have posters, right, you have stickers, that are found within the hawker center itself. There were sort of campaigns as well, and activities. Okay, so in the same year, another campaign called Courtesy Campaign, right, that started in '79 and continued for many years, was also to sort of change the kind of behavior, shall we say, of hawker center folks, but in general, the people in Singapore, right, to make them more courteous folks, right? So with these campaigns, right, it then meant that the hawker center became a place of communication. Okay, so what this means is that, you know, with the posters, right, with the kind of activities that were organized at the hawker centers, it started to serve this function, right? So much so that during the SARS period, right, 2003, okay, the hawker centers or food centers became a major place where you will find a lot of information about what to do, right? Certain kinds of community action and so on and so forth. Okay, and as the years progressed, right, that function was increased, right, to have other sorts of campaigns like lifestyle campaigns, right? Not to eat too much, right? What constitutes a healthy eating or drinking, or in 2015, you see there, you know, trying to reduce food waste, okay, because that was also becoming a problem, right? And of course, then the interesting thing, of course, in 2019, there was a push to promote hawker culture as intangible heritage, intangible world heritage. So there was also a campaign, interestingly, in the hawker centers itself. Okay, and in 2020, you know, to continue with present situation, right, COVID-19 posters and, you know, were sort of were being used in the hawker centers. Okay, so apart from posters, these are stickers, right? If you come to a hawker center, you will see, you know, these stickers, right, everywhere. Some are for information, right? Where to return your trays, or spaces that were sort of designated for the physically challenged, the disabled, but also sort of like crime, right? To warn people about crime, to talk about healthy diets. The other, of course, development was that from 1985 onwards, hawker food became sort of something that was being introduced to not just the tourists and local audiences, but also to sort of the larger populations in Singapore. So these publications, some are for locals, some are for everybody, right? For example, Makan Sutra, and so on and so forth. And in 2005, right, Singapore made it to the Michelin list, right, with designations of introductions to Singapore food, right? Michelin Guide being a kind of internationally known, I suppose, standard barrier for food, right? And this was in 2005. Okay, and then apart from those kind of introductions in books and brochures, sort of you can see, right, the Michelin label on the bottom right. That's one of the forms of accreditation. But internally, there are sort of different organizations like newspapers, magazines, TV programs that also started to create their rating systems, right, to suggest to its followers or users, where you can find the food that they would recommend, right, including this standard known as the sort of Makan Sutra chopstick system, right? So if you get three chopsticks, it will be this kind of food, good food. You get one chopstick, is not so. So there are all these rating systems, and on top of that, right, as you can see in many restaurants everywhere, on the top right, you can see that if there were sort of movie stars or public figures or ministers who have eaten at the stall, or they would take photographs and then becoming a sort of advertisement in themselves. So these sort of various functions suggested sort of the change in hawker centers in Singapore. So much so that politicians, right, would host kind of meetings. They would go there during the campaign, election campaigning. They would be there to sort of greet the users of the hawker center, right? Because that became the best place to meet people of the community, and you can see sort of on the left-hand side that happening. But also, because of the promotion, you get foreign dignitaries like Justin Trudeau and so on and so forth visiting the hawker center, top right. And even sort of chefs, right, gourmet chefs like Gordon Ramsay, Anthony Bourdain, when he was still alive, sitting with our local sort of food critic and doyen, commentator, Mr. K.F. Sito. Okay, so Gordon Ramsay in the middle right-hand side photograph is pictured in front of the chicken rice store. Right, there was this famous competition where he lost to the store owner, right, in preparing chicken rice in Singapore. So from 1971, 72 onwards, right up to 1985, 86, the building of hawker centers stopped. Okay, and that's one of the main reasons is because it was thought that all of the hawkers, right, have been taken off the streets by 1986. Okay, and then subsequently, many years later, right, 2011, hawker centers started to sort of come into the picture again, because after a hiatus of about 15 years, 20 years without the new hawker centers. In the meantime, there were new estates going on. There was a phase 4 that came in, and phase 4 meant that there was a reconsideration of what hawker centers are. and also to incorporate them into new structures. Okay, so on the left-hand side, where you have the Taman Jurong Food Center, right? This was a building that was connected to a community center. So rather than having a food center as a sort of separate entity or with a market, now it is sort of that was a sort of a very early one where you have multiple functions connecting facilities for the community. Okay, and then on the right hand side you have the top set of slides, which is Kampong Admiralty. Okay, so you have a big residential estate, right, targeted also for the silver generation, people who are sort of slightly older. But within the whole development itself, you would have a food center, okay, and also built by private architects, right, private firm. Then at the bottom right, you see what is known as the Tampines Hub. Tampines is a place in Singapore in which there's also again incorporation of a food center, hawker center inside multiple functions, right? So here you have a library, you have a kind of a sports area, arena, and swimming pool, right? Supermarket. So this is kind of mixed use development, but occupying sort of a big plot. Facility is also sort of continually being tried out. You can see here at this, which is also connected to a community club somewhere in Yishun, which is in the northern part of Singapore. There are sort of self-payment kiosks, right? So cashless payment sort of being tried out. Okay, so at the beginning it was sort of very inconvenient, right? Because you don't pay them directly, you have to collect change and all that. But in this time of COVID-19, where contact is also sort of being reconsidered, having these machines also change the way that we use our hawker center facilities. Okay, and then finally, you also have larger structures like this Satay by the Bay, right, which is somewhere in Marina Bay, where also a kind of private architect has been engaged to sort of reconsider what this kind of eating place can be. Okay, so so in conclusion, right, I've sort of moved through a very quick history of the presence of hawkers in Singapore, right? The very early stages at the turn of the 20th century, where shelters were being considered, right, as a part of sanitizing the whole island, right up to the post-war period, where another survey found that rather than being very strict with the hawkers, they continue to create spaces to accommodate them, encourage people to change vocations, and also in the same time, right, to have a whole legislation from the 1970s onwards to ensure, right, certain kind of standards, right, defined by the statutory boards of how the hawkers can operate within that. And in the meantime, of course, it became transformed not just as a place to contain the hawkers, but also sort of becoming a social space, a community space, and so on and so forth, on top of its primary functions of providing relatively affordable food, right? Because in Singapore, you have three main types of establishments. Okay, so on the one hand of the scale is the hawker center, the food center, and then you have coffee shops, right? And then of course you also have food courts. Okay, so on the right hand side in 1985, this was the very first time that the idea of the hawker center is sort of moved indoors, right? With most of the time it's an air-conditioned space. So from that time onwards, you would have hawker center, right? You have coffee shops, you have a food court, and then of course outside of this is the restaurant. Okay, and the prices of food in general, right, starts at the lowest in the hawker center all the way to restaurants in that order. Okay, so the and with the change to kind of a social function and its additional aspects about media representation, guidebooks, tourism, right? and there is a sort of continuous change of how hawker centers operate in Singapore, right up to its recognition as World Heritage. So although the term hawker as an itinerant is still in the name, right? This hawker center is still sort of very much part of life in Singapore, right? There are sort of they're facing a lot of challenges, but by and large, right, hopefully, there is a way to sustain this hawker culture for a long time to come. Okay. With that, thank you, Desmond, for the invitation and to talk about this subject. Thank you very much.
Chian for the talk. So so now the floor is open for the Q&A section. You may want to use the raise hand function so to indicate you would like to raise the questions, or you may use the chat box function to type your question and then I'll read it out. You're more than welcome to raise your question in English or in Mandarin, Hokkien, or Cantonese. So we've got one question here from George. What's the difference between hawker centers and food courts?
Well, mainly the food courts are mainly in private establishments, in buildings, and they are usually air conditioned. Yeah. So the jurisdiction of stalls within a food court is not a public entity. Hawker centers at the beginning, right, from 50s onwards, there would be a lot of statutory boards that would sort of monitor them, right? They would pay, the hawkers themselves would have to pay for electricity, right? Each stall will use different amounts of electricity, water, and so on and so forth. They would be checked by sort of the health agencies, and they have to toe the lines, right? What is permissible, what is not permissible. So there's a level of public scrutiny for hawker centers, like the ones that were built, right? But and food courts would be largely privatized, right? They would happen in public, buildings, right? Nowadays, there are also some in public buildings. There would also be mainly in sort of malls, right? And the privatization would also, be the privatization would also sort of mean that a management company would take over the management of all the stalls, and then sublet to the different stalls. Okay, so that privatization for food courts started first. Recently, there's also sort of been that kind of sort of management control for hawker centers. It's still being played out, right? I don't think it was as efficient or useful as the previous model, right, where the different agencies were sort of managing, how it operates, right? Because now you have a middleman who then has, and middleman, of course, means that there are additional costs, right? And they would even sort of have centralized washing, for example, and certain kinds of policies. They can sort of charge rents, right? They can sort of change things within the hawker center, the kind of hawker center. So the major difference, of course, is the environment, right? It would be, hawker centers would still be sort of more open air, right? But sheltered, and food courts would mainly be within the building.
So Yin has a question. I'm just wondering, is the word hawker still being used officially, or is it mainly food center, etc.?
Sorry, can you say that again?
So there is a question from Yin. So who's asking, just wondering, is the word hawker still being used officially, or is it mainly food center?
If you go to the places themselves, they would say food center, because that's technically that's the correct one. But because the term hawker has been used so often ever since 1908 maybe. So the name, as I mentioned early on, it's an oxymoron, of course, right? Hawkers are meant to be mobile, right? That's why I use the term itinerants. But everybody calls it that, So although it's probably kind of a strange thing to call them hawkers, in a fixed setting, everybody calls it hawkers. So you can see even for the application for World Heritage, they say it's Singapore's hawker culture. They don't say it's a food culture. So by that they mean food that is in these kinds of structures, right, known as open air food centers and hawker centers. So even politicians will continue to use the term hawkers, right, to describe people who are working there. But the other sort of very tenuous connection to hawking is that a lot of these hawkers, they also move from place to place, right? So that's why that suggestion of where you come from is important, right? So the food, so it's like beef noodles, okay? So if I say beef noodles, it doesn't carry any weight. But if I say Funan Funan street noodles or something, right, or bedok satay, then it sort of carries weight. But most of the time they are moving from place to place as well. They, a lot of the sort of better known hawkers who have been sort of moving since the 1950s now, that they wouldn't also be in one place. So there's a very tenuous connection of sort of moving around. But by and large, the more the bigger reason, right, why they're still called hawkers is because everyone is now they're just commonly called hawker centers, right? Although if you go and see the official sign, right, they would say food center. Hopefully, yeah, it's confusing, but that's how it is at the moment.
So, Chicken, I would like to have a follow-up question on that, especially when you mentioned on the issue of nowadays the hawker culture is being recognized as a world heritage. So by that heritagizing the hawker culture or hawker, do they actually mean the food itself, the food per se, or they're talking about the whole setting, about how to prepare the food, where to sell the food, and how to consume the food? Otherwise, if all these food, let's say, move to a hotel, well, that will be okay. People will think, okay, in terms of upgrading or making it more posh kind of thing, will it be, let's say, against the concept of heritagizing the hawker culture?
Yeah, this is a very good question. From what I understand, right, you can see, I don't know if you can see this, the poster, right? The poster itself says our SG, right, Singapore. SG is Singapore, our SG hawker culture. So by this, they mean the entire sort of ecosystem, right? It's not just because it says, okay, hawker, right? And I mean, it's equally problematic if you say hawker culture or hawking culture or hawker center culture. So it's a kind of understood as a very general, all-encompassing phrase to mean the components, the physical components, the structures, the hawker centers that have been built, right, or particularly the 1971 to 1986 ones, right? Those are the ones that are has sort of become the most popular, right, from the 1970s to 1980s, right? In particular, so places like Newton Hawker Center, Tiong Bahru, those are like, Maxwell Market. Those are like the physical infrastructure, right down to and of course these hawker centers are not just any sort of a construction where you can just go there and have somebody cooking and somebody eating. Right? That was earlier on in the 50s to the 1970s. That was the case, right? But there's a lot of very heavy servicing, right? There's a lot of efforts to sort of make it a pleasant environment, right? You will sweat, but you won't, at least you can sit there for, I don't know, half an hour to 1 hour to eat your food. And therefore it's sort of all-encompassing word. They don't, so although it says hawker culture, right, it also means it's everything, okay, including the people who use the space, okay, and in that respect, that's actually quite important, because what the hawker culture also means that it is a place where the different ethnic groups can come together. Okay, so in Singapore, this sort of ethnic issue is always a very, very touchy one, and sort of there are very sort of there are not that many spaces, although we hope that there are more, that it can be enjoyed by everyone. Of course, there's a sort of like a quota system, that works in the hawker center. But by and large, right? I mean, most of the time, the first time you try somebody else's food, roti prata, laksa, that kind of thing, satay, that will likely be at the hawker center when you are with friends and all that. So the hawker culture also refers to the culture that has been set up over the years, right? So this is something that's built up. Okay, so in the beginning there were fights and so on and so forth, but now hopefully you don't see any you don't see any fights. There are sort of proper ways of over the evolution of that over the different phases, you get this entire culture itself. Okay, so therefore as the poster suggests, it's not easy to just use one sentence or a paragraph to contain, to sort of say what it is. Okay, we can start by saying the short term for it is hawker culture, but it includes all of these things. Okay, and it's something that I suppose everybody is so quite proud of. I'm sure much more than the Botanic Gardens, who sort of is the formal. I won't say anymore, but I'm just saying that that's something that everybody can participate in. Everybody probably has eaten at the hawker center in Singapore, unless you are sort of very rich. And so that kind of wider scope allows a connection to this culture as well. So I think if you ask most Singaporeans, you will hear them saying that it's not the people cooking, not the people eating, but the whole sort of history and culture that goes with it, right? And I suppose what I did was also sort of to push it back to a much earlier era, so that we can see in perspective the different attempts at trying to sort of restrict or control this whole culture, and then also to see how it has the food itself, the people itself have moved, right, from the early colonial, serving the colonial officers, the business districts, to now, which is becoming quite ubiquitous across Singapore, right? And something that you'll be happy to bring your tourist friends or other friends to the places to enjoy a meal or to talk, right? So to cut a long story short, it's a short term, but I'm sure in the applications for UNESCO Intangible World Heritage, these are all sort of very specifically spelled out.
We have also a few questions coming in. So perhaps I'll start from the earlier stage. The question on the earlier stage. This is a question from Fun. So in phase 1, when the hawker shelters were built, was there any compensation when creating the backlinks, and how was it being communicated? Was managed.
Okay, I think that was instituted by law, if I'm not wrong. I have not really sort of read too much about it, but if if you are interested, you can look into the report itself, but that's very hard to find. The other very good book that describes this process in detail is Brenda Yeo's book, on sort of the colonial space in Singapore, and this describes the different regulations and how the community sort of react to it. Okay, so if I'm wrong to answer to try to answer your question, that there was a very strong hand of the colonial government, shall we say, right, in creating it, because because that was very crucial, right, because of to solve this twin problem of congestion and sanitation. Okay, because just like COVID-19 and all that, it was something that required alterations to the physical space, right? So just like the COVID-19 or SARS, or even Amtrak and all that, these are deemed to use physical space, right? Just all the way from the Simpson report, right? Using physical space, the alteration of the physical space to achieve an objective. Okay, so in the case of the 1907 report, right, there was a widespread communicable diseases, right, tuberculosis, things like that. Not just those that you get from food, right, but those that you can pass from person to person, right, just like SARS, just like COVID-19, right. So as we can see in COVID-19, there's so many changes to physical space. So as a kind of analogy, that was also what was happening back then, like the cutting up of back lanes, right, and the creation of some kind of access. And also there's a lot of risk as well, right, because if you are, let's say you're trapped, right, let's say you're trapped in the early situation that I described, there's nowhere to go short of climbing over the wall to the neighbor, right. It's public safety as well. And the public safety risk, of course, increases because the back area is where the kitchens are, right? And because many families would use the kitchen, right, both on the upper floors, so there's always an increased risk, right, when people take turns to start to cook. Okay, so I would think that the colonial government came down, the municipality came down very hard on the residents, right? But this was a necessity, right, that they saw important, right, to solve this situation arising from Simpson's report. So the best way is to read Brenda Yeo's book. Sorry.
So there is another question by Kenneth. So is there any initiative to equip public hawker centers with aircon system? And he would like to know more about how the locals in general perceive the so-called aircon food centers.
Okay. So far, there are no hawker centers with air conditioning plants, because when they were built, they were, as I tried to describe in the talk, all the sites are open, right? There are no sort of shutters to pull down to close off the space, right? So in the evenings, right, you want to have a meeting, right? Right now, of course, it's not possible for COVID-19, but you could, right, just stay in a hawker center for a very long time, right? So that it's never completely closed, right? There's no closure. Whereas in the food court, right, perhaps that's another difference, is that there will be particular operating hours, right? So the short answer is that if you want to air conditioning the space, you have to alter the entire thing, because it's not just only the sides that you have to seal off. You also have to sort of seal off the roof, right? The jack roofs, right? The gaps between the different kinds of roofs, which is which is designed to create a tolerable, tropical situation, right? So as long as you, the design rationale is as long as you can serve these basic functions, right? Keeping out the rain, keeping out the sun, right? Cutting down the glare, maintaining usable space inside, making sure that both the store owners who cook the food, as well as the patrons who sit there, who are sitting there eating their food, in a comfortable environment, then there is right now still no perceived need for air conditioning, right? Because air conditioning also then adds to the maintenance of the hawker center itself. Okay, and if you look at the sort of energy trends today, that's something that's very hard to justify, right? Because air condition is the largest energy consumption component, right, in any of the buildings. So in fact, to install air conditions in a structure that wasn't designed to have air conditions would be, number one, counter to the kind of environmental initiative, and number two, right, the infrastructure to convert all of these structures into air-conditioned spaces would require a lot of work, right? So what has happened, of course, is that beginning with the very first food court that I showed just now in 1980s, there's also a parallel increase in the number of food courts, and some of them are even sort of run by the NTUC, right, which is kind of a cooperative movement that is now organizing different kinds of multi-purpose things, and so there are now quite a number of food courts, as well as the number of hawker centers that exist. So I think it's a matter of choice now for people who, if they really need the air-conditioned space, and I know some friends who would never go into a hawker center because it's too hot, then they will have to, it's a lifestyle choice, right? So they have to then figure out where to buy their food, right? Whether from coffee shops, which are also not completely air conditioned, to the food courts, right, which are air conditioned, or even to restaurants which are also air conditioned. So I think it's becoming a matter of choice, and and right now at the moment in time, I think to try to air condition the space would not just only be counterintuitive, but I think a lot of the energy consumption issues and environmental issues will have to be resolved. Okay, because for air conditioning, there's a lot of additional hardware that you need, right? Condensers, things like that. So that would actually add additional space and of course, environmentally is not sound. I mean, we now know that air conditioning is only sort of created to help you to be comfortable for a while, but it doesn't mean that the heat is going away, right? The heat is rechanneled to the back lanes, rechanneled to the entire environment. So in a sort of larger environmental calculation, right, at the moment there is no plan to install air cons in hawker centers. But there is choice, right? There are people who will choose not to eat at hawker centers, and they will then choose the comfort of food courts and restaurants. Hopefully that helps to answer, because I personally don't see this as possible development, because I think that's when you've also been to a lot of the hawker centers. So they are generally quite comfortable, right? So even for people like Anthony Bourdain, Trudeau, right? I think all of these leaders, right? Even the North Korean leader, who's that guy, Kim Jong, he's been there, right? So these are people who are not from the tropics, but they have found it to be, they can accept the kind of environment. Sorry, I think it's a long-winded answer, but generally, I think there are choices now. If you really need to eat in an air-conditioned space, they would go to those choices.
Yeah. Here's a question from Lipsin. So Lipsin would like to know about the universal values of Singapore's hawker culture that contribute to the world, which makes it worthy to be inscribed as an intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO.
Is that our friend, Mr.
Yeah,
Lipsin?
our friend Lipsin.
I'm very surprised he asked that question because I'm not a spokesman for the the government agencies, right? I've just been invited to talk about this by our mutual friend, Dr. Desmond Shum. So perhaps, Lipsin, if you can indulge me, I think all the good things and not so good things I've already sort of described in the talk, and perhaps, right, you can ask for universal values. I'm certainly not a person who can sort of say for sure, right, as an authority that, oh, this is a universal value. So please forgive me, Lipsin. I think I can only sort of I can try and step out of this whole application process, which I think I've done today to talk about it, right? So it's really I suppose that's really to do my job, right? To say what it is, right? Rather than to say it from a perspective of trying to do certain tasks, right? To get into the sort of UNESCO World Heritage thing, and therefore these are the universal values, right? But a lot of these things you can see that at least for it to have existed for so long, right, as I described, it's a kind of an ambivalent process, in the sense that on the one hand, you want to get rid of it, and a lot of countries have sort of tried to get rid of hawkers completely. On the other hand, they also see the value. So it's really trying to balance all these things to try to create eventually the physical structures, which then help to foster all of these sort of social connections and cultural connections. Sorry, Lipsin.
Another question from Wei Wing Lui. Is there a ratio of residents to hawker centers? So are there any ratios being, let's say, how many residents, and then you need to build a hawker center? Are there any ratios in this?
If you talk about the public housing estates, right, that are built by the HDB, that goes according to the logic of designing housing estates. So if you invite me for another talk about public housing, I can discuss it. But generally, what happens is that for each large town, right, there would be each large public housing town, there would be a town center, right? So they would say, for example, you have Toa Payoh town, and then you have a Toa Payoh town center. If you have Ang Mo Kio town, you have a Ang Mo Kio town center. Okay, so this town center would be sort of like the nucleus of the entire estate, right? You would have a lot of amenities. You would have post offices, supermarkets. You have even shopping centers and so on and so forth. But you would also have a whole series of local shops, and so on and so forth. So that's the core of the town itself, and then the substructure is what is termed as neighborhoods. Okay, and the neighborhoods, so there will be several neighborhoods that are distributed around the town center. These would be serviced by bus routes, internal bus routes within the town. Okay, and of course, if the residents drive, then there are sort of car parks. Okay, so theoretically, within a neighborhood, you would find 1, 2 to 3 markets and hawker centers according to that kind of distribution. So there is some kind of figure to sort of roughly distribute these markets and food centers. But of course, the populations change as well. Right? So say, for example, in Queenstown, right, when the populations change, right, the amenities also change. Right? I remember growing up in Queenstown, just along Margaret Drive, there would be 8 schools. Okay, but now it's not sustainable because all of the residents have grown up. So in the same way, I think subsequently there is no ratio or number to use for calculations, but they are evenly distributed within neighborhoods. Okay, so for neighborhoods there is a smaller subdivision. I can't what it is now. So there is a precinct. Okay, so the structure of a town is a big town with the town center in the middle. Then the other areas are divided into neighborhoods, and each of the neighborhoods is comprised of what is known as precincts. Okay, so you have a lot of you have sort of say like 4 to 10 blocks within a precinct. Okay, so in a precinct you would have some shops, right? You would have what is called a mama shop or mamak shop, right? But then a few for 1 or 2 or 3 precincts, then there would be a hawker center or food center. So it depends on the size of the neighborhood. Okay, so for example, in my neighborhood, there's already 2 to 3 hawker centers, and that's because Ang Mo Kio was where I live. Is designed as a very sort of dense town, denser than the previous developments. So there is some kind of form of calculation, but roughly, if you look at the neighborhoods, it's safe to say that there are 2, 3, 4 food centers in that. So, but of course, this is right up until 1986. Okay, because 1986, remember, from 1986 to 2011. Right, the building of hawker centers was stopped. So I think a lot of the estates, right, in say places like Punggol and all that, for the longest time they do not have, or Bukit Panjang, they do not have a hawker center. Right? They would have hot food courts, they would have restaurants, right? They would have different places, coffee shops and all that. But what was missing, right, from 1986 to 2011 in the newer towns that were developed, the absence of hawker centers. So I think with this realization, that's why the phase 4 return. Right, there was a announcement to build, 20 over. Right, they don't want to specify the number because it's still expanding, and therefore now you can see, right, Bukit Panjang Food Center was built as a phase 4 one. Even sort of after the Bukit Panjang town was sort of already developed. So I think if you talk about the different phases, like the calculations are different. And from 1971 to 1986, right, 100 over were built in all of the sort of towns that were developed in that time. But then 86 to 2011, there were no. So there's the calculation is 0, right? And then from 2011 onwards, for the public housing estates, the whole process started again. Yeah. So for different phases, I think the considerations were different, but roughly that was a kind of time frame to see the whole thing, right? And in response to Lipson's question, I can only stay as a kind of an independent commentator because a lot of the people who have talked about this topic, right, including Professor Lily Kong, in their books, they will say that the hawker centers begin in 1950 or 1970s. But I think usually that colonial period will not be discussed. So I think it's only fair to suggest, if you want to talk about the entire development, to sort of try to see it as a longer process, and in the 4 phases that perhaps we can use to describe it. And in each of the phases, the considerations, right, and the way that we think about what hawker centers are change with time. So right now, the new types of hawker centers are also very different from the phase 3 ones, right? So for example, phase 4 hawker centers give a lot of priority to the so-called architecture of the place. But what happens then is that the number of stalls are drastically reduced. Okay, so for example, in the phase 3 hawker centers, typically you would have 40 to 60 stalls. So in places like Old Airport food center, there's even more. It's like really a lot of stalls, right? But of course, that place doesn't have a lot of residents compared to Ang Mo Kio, right? Or Bukit Panjang. But in phase 4, right, a lot of the, say for example, Bukit Panjang food center, the number of stalls are drastically reduced. So the consideration again is sort of different. Right? So there's a provision, but the number of stalls are definitely much less than those that are in phase 3. So even with, if let's say there are sort of similar kinds of numbers, and in fact, they're now increasing because they're now building, 40-story HDB blocks and so on and so forth. That consideration sometimes comes into play, it seems, and sometimes it doesn't come into play. So that number equation kind of thing also has to be looked into. And also there's a question of the reputation of the food center itself. So say, for example, the very easy way to suggest why hawker centers are important, each of the stalls are important, is to see the longevity. Okay, and there's a reason why Whampoa Food Center and Tiong Bahru Food Center draw really big crowds, and that's because they were established during the SIT era from the 1950s onwards, right? So that there's a sort of lots of cycles that have already happened. A lot of the older hawkers are still operating in them, compared to sort of people who are now sort of starting out, right? Especially with now COVID, I think there are also some people who are so, despite how challenging it is to become a hawker, there are still people who are considering it as a vocation. So once again, I've sort of gone on for too long, but it seems to me that there are certain times when the population numbers are considered, but at other times, the population numbers are not considered, right? And in fact, you can even have a period from 86 to 2011 that completely did not consider having hawker centers in public housing estate.
Yep. So Chicken, there's a question from George about, so you said phase 4 is to 2027. Why 2027?
That is actually taken from reports. That's why I think maybe I should have changed the date, because subsequent to the preparation of this, which was a while ago, they have tentatively said it was until 2027, but they may change the consideration for a longer period, and so on and so forth. Because I think after a hiatus of 15 years and with a new kind of hawker center design, I think they also need to sort of monitor this whole process of reintroducing these kinds of food centers or hawker centers back into the public realm. So to answer this very shortly, which I don't seem to have done for many of the questions, really, I think they need to tweak the period, right? Because I've got the number from newspaper reports, okay, but I think subsequently they have just only a starting date, which is 2011, but they may consider it for a longer time period for the construction of for this, right? So once again, I cannot represent the Environment Ministry and also the Housing Development Board. So I'm not sure what the plans are, but I can discuss the start date of phase 4. Right? Phase 4 is something that I created because no one has sort of, it's not an official term. These are made from the study and observations that I've made, right? And basically it's to tie in with the first phase with a sanitation report, 1908, the second phase, 1950, right, post-war period, but there was a hawker inquiry, right, which also yielded certain sort of constraints or permissions. Then, of course, when the first few hawker centers are created, like Newton Hawker Center and so on and so forth. Newton is also a very old thing and also very popular amongst tourists, but not locals. that also sort of can be seen as a phase, right, when they start, when the local government started to build again. So that we can trace the what I call phase 3. Okay, and then phase 4, I think it's also quite distinct, right, because we know that it has stopped at a particular time. Okay, and then 2011 the thing starts again. So that phase, I would call it phase 4. Yeah.
So here's a question from student from the class, Dodom. So you've emphasized the public aspects of the hawker center compared to food court, which is usually fall under the private company management. So she would like to know, most hawker center managed by the government, and let's say if she would like to rent a space in hawker center to run her business. So is it that means that she should contact the government agencies to see whether there's this space, and is it not allowed to trade within the private sector? Or
not allowed to trade.
Or shall I rephrase it? So nowadays, all hawker center are under management of government agency. Are there any hawker center under the management of a private sector?
The short answer is yes. Right. The short answer is yes, because during the early phases, right, during the phase 1 and phase 2, of course, the colonial government were and the municipality in particular, right, the municipality and then the city council subsequently, were monitoring and sort of controlling the regulations and the designations and so on and so forth, collecting rental, the provision of water. Okay, and then from 71 onwards, right up to 86, there was involvement from the different statutory boards of the government agency. So, for example, if we were under HDB, right, the housing board would have jurisdiction, and in fact they had computerized details of each hawker, right, in the data bank by, I think, 1990s, right. So that's again that part of the control, and so if it's under the Port Authority, then Port of Singapore Authority will have some jurisdiction. Okay, and this was also a time when the hawker departments were sort of moved function across the board, right? different government agencies. So Public Works Department, URA, they were involved. Okay, but after 1986, and when in recent times, the management have also begun to be privatized, right? So for a lot of the hawker centers, there is an intermediary now. Right? I think that's also sort of something that people are now sort of discussing, because a lot of the, if you can just Google this, right? Some of the issues with the hawker centers is that the management company, right? So again, right, this is kind of like a neoliberal sort of handling of the whole situation, which is to have all these some of the government functions are now sort of in the hands of a management company, and they will answer to the different agencies like the environment agencies and so on and so forth, who will still sort of conduct the tests and all that. But a lot of the sort of conditions like washing the floor, right, management fees, even as I mentioned earlier, the centralized washing, right, rather than each of the hawkers handling their own utensils and crockery. There would be management companies, and this was a model that was used in some of the coffee shops and some of the food centers as well. So we are beginning to see quite a lot of the hawker centers that are sort of run by management companies rather than a direct contact with government agencies, as was the case from the 70s onwards. So that there is a change in the in the management of these hawker centers as well. So for example, I was very excited to find that the Balestier Food Center, which was a phase one a food center. So I was very happy because apart from Lau Pa Sat, which everybody knows, there was a purpose-built market and food center. So when I was interviewed and all that, I said, well, let's go to Balestier Road to talk about the hawker center, because this is a very, very early hawker center, right, 1920s onwards. And of course, the production companies found out that they had to seek permission from a private company to be able to film the discussion in the Balestier Road Food Center. So Balestier Road Food Center is, of course, again, sort of run by this management company. Oh yeah, and now I remember, to tie in with this aircon question, right? What has happened in the Balestier Food Center, and maybe many places elsewhere, is that because the management is under that company, particularly in Balestier Food Center, they have installed air chillers, right? So they have these big machines that are there to probably also to entice, right, people to have a cooler environment. But if you ask me, those are not really necessary, because after you sit down about 15 minutes and all that, you won't feel as hot as when you first came in. Right? So in any case, right, for the Balestier Food Center, the management company has installed air chillers, right, to try and cool down the environment. So this is something that I suppose, right, is being done, and also the reason why people are sort of discussing, because when they say you have to pay a certain amount of money for washing the dishes and all that, it's a standardized cost, right? So nobody can complain. And actually, there's a big it's actually causing a lot of strains on any hawker, because apart from the rental, which also is fluctuating, right? Right now, because it's privatized, sometimes there are also changing hands of different owners, right? There was a report, okay? I didn't do this research myself, but there's a report that sometimes even a stall in a very popular area would change hands, sub-rent and then sub-rent and then sub-rent many times, and in the process, creating very, very high rents. So it's a matter of whether you want to desperate enough on the space or not to operate as a stall owner, and if you want to, then you will still pay these very high rents to a so the sub-landlord who pays to another sub-landlord, and so on and so forth. So there's some level of privatization that's going on, but this was not the case when it started out in the 1970s. So if that's the case, then of course there is a different way that the stores are operating. Okay, and all of these things, of course, then naturally increase the cost of food production, the cost of materials, but again, Singaporeans, but they'll still expect to have affordable food. Okay, and as I mentioned, right, the scale of food is supposed to be the most affordable in the hawker center stalls, then the coffee shop, and then the food court, and then the restaurants. So if you look at the larger level of things, right, hawker centers have some, it's actually a kind of very important social amenity, because it is also where you get the most affordable type of food that will sustain a lot of needy families, especially those that sort of have children who are growing up, things like that. Sorry, again, a very long answer. Hopefully it's satisfactory. But if you just Google newspaper reports about certain events that are happening recently, I think you'll find sort of the kind of different scenarios, right, happening in the different especially newer hawker centers, which are managed by private companies.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Chee Kien. So our talk was scheduled from 1:30 to 3:30 Taipei time today, and now it's 3:37. So thanks very much for your Chican's informative talk. And there's just a few questions coming in. I don't know whether you still have some time to answer some of it, or
sure. How do you have this Zoom talk on?
So
yeah, we can. I suppose we can try and answer a few more.
Okay. So
if you're okay.
Okay, sure. Let me read out these questions. So some of the questions are related to what you call the backstage, the backstage of all these grease trap or tray return thing. So for the grease trap, for geese being trapped, what are they being reused in some sort of thing? And there is also one audience who would like to know about your comments on the trade return policy. So recently there was this announcement to find the customers for not returning trays in the future. So what's your thoughts on this trade return policy? And there is also this question about right nowadays because of COVID. So no more eat in, everyone about everyone need to take away. So would this make the relevancy of hawker center change or not?
Okay, so that's like three related questions, I think.
Yep.
So I'll go through them one by one. First one I think is about thank you for the questions. The first one is about the grease trap. Well, the grease trap is something that's actually quite important because if you travel to some of the other food places or even when you organize food streets and all that, that there is not because the streets are not designed for the specific use of a hawker center or food establishment, so you would not have grease traps normally, but that is a setup where you have to separate the waste from the grease, right, which floats to the top, and then of course that as I mentioned serves a public function of not clogging up the drains. Okay, so the grease, right, has to be removed. The waste that somehow makes it to settle on the low level has to be removed. And it's interesting because sometimes there are now companies, and in fact I've encountered a company, a truck, right, that came to suck away the grease, and of course I was very interested because finally I see how it's being extracted. Okay, so at first I thought it was just an extraction, but when I inquired, it appears that there is some use for the grease, right, and they are extracting it. In fact, the company was drove all the way from Johor, right? So I'm not sure if what the arrangement is, but they think that they extracted the grease so that it can be reused for something else. Okay, so I'm not sure what it is because I don't think I didn't ask them. So the grease is definitely extracted, right? The kind of solid waste that somehow got into the grease trap is also extracted. Okay, and then of course the wastewater is then passed into the sewage or drainage system. Okay, so hopefully that answers the first question. All right, the second question is about tray return, right? If I'm not wrong, I do think that for the longest time, I think that policy of returning trays, we find that in especially schools where this kind of behavior can be monitored by people of authority, right, like teachers, discipline masters, and things like that. So, but unfortunately, that has not sort of become a lot more, more expressed in the in hawker centers, right? So that's actually a shame, because I think there are several, of course, related problems, and the worst one is that, you know, if you leave a tray unattended, there actually will be birds, you know, and sort of other things that will come and pick at it, right? And what this does is also that they will create more cleaning issues for later, right? And therefore, I think that was also the reason why tray return points were set up, right? So encourage people to return the trays and the crockery. So, you know, I'm sure that's not a problem in Taiwan, because I think that's quite most of the people, they would return the trays. But recently, you know, the enforcement, right, to have in a few months' time, right, it is mandatory to return the trays. Personally, if you ask me, I think it's a good move, but I think it's also an unfortunate one, because you know, why is one not responsible for the mess that one creates, right, when you eat at an establishment, right? Perhaps, you know, if you're in a restaurant, you know, you think that the 10% service charge you pay includes, you know, the clearing up. But I think if you look on the whole, right, that the hawker center is a kind of public space, then I think there also should be some kind of public responsibility to help to maintain it, right? In fact, I think the tray return policy is not enough. I think, you know, if you respect the space that you're in as a food establishment, in fact, you should clear. There should be another place where the food waste, right? You should empty the food waste. You should empty your tissues, your ice cubes, you know, and so on and so forth, before returning to the tray return station. But that's me, and I think perhaps it's the first step, right, to get people to start to return tray. But that's my own opinion. But if you look at the science, it also suggests that enforcement, right? It's not. At first, it's ambivalence, right? That you allow this thing to take place, then you require workers to clean them. But if it doesn't work, then, you know, the other side of the ambivalence comes in, and therefore you have to enforce with you know, regulations and laws, right? that come with penalties and fines. So perhaps that answers the second question. Can you remind me the third question again?
So with food takeaway taking roots, will hawker centers still have relevance? So everyone talk about
especially during the COVID. All right, okay. Yes, I remember now. Thank you for the question. I think the hawker center space, of course, unfortunately, right, like most of the public spaces, were not built to cater to COVID-19 situations, right? i.e., you need to have a much more sanitized place. It already was quite a sanitized place, right? In fact, you know, they have daily washing of the floors and so on and so forth. You know, the regulation system, right? The demerit point system and the grading system, A, B, C, D, right? The regular checks by the environmental agencies. So those are already in place to at least help it to be kind of you know, a place that's fit for food consumption. But the public aspect of it is that you have groups of people gathering to enjoy the food, right? In together with company, right? Together with friends, relatives, right? In fact, there are, you know, they become places to meet as well, right? There are families who, right, because the parents are working, they will spend their evenings at the hawker centers themselves. So it was built for a place of gathering, right, and exchange, right? That's also why, you know, most of the time when it's crowded, you know, it's hard to find a seat. You have to use your umbrella or the token of a packet of tissues, right? That's like a symbol that everybody understands now. You put a packet of tissues, you have reserved the seat. So those are for sort of communal functions, not for COVID-19. So hopefully COVID-19 gets resolved. We don't know when, a year, 2 years from now, but But right now at this stage, right, in the midst of phase 4, perhaps, all of the hawker centers have been built for community functions. Okay, and the capacity and the function of the hawker center itself during COVID is now just takeaway. Okay, but we have also seen various degrees of how it can be used. Right, so you've seen probably in Singapore, right, people taping up seats. Right, some can be 2-person seating, although the capacity is 4. Some of them can have like 4 persons in this family. So the spaces can be altered to in relation to the stages, but technically all the stalls can still operate, right? If there is still enough clientele, right? Right now they're also facing a crisis because it's a lot of it is online booking of food, and fewer people just go directly to the hawker centers to buy food. But it doesn't stop all of this. So technically, it doesn't stop all of the stores from opening, right? There are sort of certain ways to get around it, and it's quite unlike the other public spaces which are completely closed off. Like for example, gyms are completely closed off. There's a restriction now to how many people go to the office. In Taiwan, I think at this stage I don't know why it's still possible to have half working staff, because based on the experiences that we have, they should try to stop 90% of the office work, but maybe it's a transition issue. But the hawker centers are still functioning through the circuit breaker, through the different stages that we have, and of course that's not ideal. Right? The ideal, of course, is to return back to the situation for most of the studies that I've made, and a lot of people have made, and also part of the reason why the Heritage Board was confident enough to apply for United Nations recognition as an intangible heritage. So yes, COVID has changed the use of the space, but fortunately enough, it's not a contained space like air-conditioned spaces. Right, so nowadays, even for theaters and cinemas, there's a lot of restrictions because it's an enclosed space. So going back to that question also, fortunately, it wasn't air-conditioned, or it wasn't considered important, because then it would be same as the other air-conditioned public spaces, where you would actually see much more stringent spatial conditions and the use compared to what we see now as in the hawker centers, which are still able to provide food. If either through Grab drivers, or people going to the neighborhood hawker centers to buy food. So interestingly, the funny thing is that going back to the service deliverers, right? One of the very interesting points is that in the past, the hawkers came to the neighborhood to sell things, right? They came to the wayang, the operas, they came to different things. So they were mobile. And then after a while, they are hawker centers, and therefore they become fixed. Okay. And with the provision of these food delivery services, the whole thing has now sort of gone back to, you can stay wherever you are, like especially in the COVID situation. And so you will have these food delivery personnel risking their lives to get food to where you are. So that's sort of an interesting observation, right? That you can still now stay at home, but you can still order food from there. And so in the same way that whatever kind of food was provided was through these itinerant hawkers in the past. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Lai. So, and especially thanks very much for the reminder of the itineraries is still taking place, but in another way until today. So Chian has shared us the information of a talk on Singapore hawker culture, a webinar series will be on 10th of June, and I'll paste the I'll paste the link of the registration link on the chat box so people can check it out. And thanks for Chian's talk today, and thank you very much for everyone's attending. And this talk will be later will be uploaded to the ICCS webpage. Our webpage is iccs.nctu.edu.tw. You may check it out about the talk of Chian's talk today later from our website. So thank you very much for everyone's attending, and stay healthy, stay safe. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you, Desmond. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.